So for the second talk, we have Cornelia Caragea to talk about exploring optimism and pessimism in Twitter.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited to be here and to present this optimism and pessimism analysis from Twitter. This is a joint work with colleagues from University of Bucharest. I am showing here a quote from a movie in which the main character was a very pessimistic person, and finally she realizes that her negative feelings impact in a very negative way her family and her very close friends, and decides to change her moods. So optimism and pessimism are feelings that are affected by one's personality from a very early age and can impact one's mental and physical health. Pessimism can induce suicidal thoughts, whereas optimism can help reduce stress and promote well-being. To date, there are many studies about optimism and pessimism in psychology. Recently, computational models, large-scale computational models, have started to explore optimism and pessimism in Twitter. But these works just use a bag of words approach in conjunction with machine learning, traditional machine learning classifiers like support vector machine and naive Bayes. However, a deeper understanding of the text that accounts for the textual semantic similarities is required in order to correctly detect the characteristics of pessimism and optimism. And towards this end, our contributions are as follows. We explore and contrast deep learning with traditional machine learning models to see if deep learning models would capture characteristics of optimism and pessimism better than traditional models. We also show that sentiment analyzer is not appropriate for predicting optimism and pessimism in Twitter. And so we were motivated by, so we basically submitted several tweets from the two categories, pessimism and optimism, to the Stanford NLP toolkit, sentiment analyzer, and we found that a lot of these optimistic tweets were labeled as negative tweets, whereas the ones pessimistic were labeled as positive, as shown in the examples here. And then last we do a linguistics analysis where we show the usage of verbs, the verb tenses, as well as the polarity word, the presence of polarity words in tweets. The data sets that we used are provided by Ruan et al. And I call this first data set Optimism. So the way it was annotated, each tweet was annotated on a scale from -3 to 3, from very pessimistic to very optimistic. We used two different thresholds, 0, so everything that has a score greater than 0 was labeled as optimistic, and then less than 0 was labeled as pessimistic. And then we also use a threshold of 1 and -1. For the sentiment analysis part, we use two data sets for sentiment analysis, the Stanford Sentiment Tree Bank and the Twitter Sentiment Analysis, a data set that has more than 1.5 million tweets classified with their sentiment. First, I show the comparison, the exploration of deep learning approaches for this task. We explored several deep learning models, for example, BiLSTM, CNN, convolutional neural networks, and the gated recurrent unit stacked gated RNNs. and compared them with bag of words, knife base, and SVM. And as we can see, models that were trained with deep learning, and particularly with GRU model, performed best at threshold 0, whereas the CNN performed best at threshold 1-1, and outperformed significantly the traditional models, SVM and knife base, that used the TF-IDF encoding for the tweets. So we studied to see if a sentiment analyzer will be appropriate to correctly predict optimism and pessimism. And we explored, again here, several models. I only show the results for CNN because they performed best. We used several other deep learning models for training on the sentiment datasets, which I denoted SST and TSA. So we used SST and TSA for training, and then we used SST again here for the development, for selecting a model. And then our test set was the optimism and pessimism data set. And then, so as we can see here, the performance is quite low compared with the performance that we get when we train on the optimism and pessimism data set. Here I show the correlation between sentiment and optimism. So these are the normalized number of tweets, optimistic and pessimistic tweets, that were predicted as negative, neutral, and positive, with a CNN model that was trained on the TSA dataset. And we can see that there is a fairly good correlation between pessimism and negative sentiment, about 62%. But a lot of the tweets are also classified from the pessimistic category, are also classified as negative and, as neutral and positive. And finally, I show the performance on the linguistics analysis. So we studied the verb tenses, the occurrence of present, past, and future tenses. And as we can see, most of the tweets corresponding to both categories, optimism and pessimism, are written at present tense, followed by past tense and then future tense. There are some verbs that are predominant in both categories, but there are others that are more predominant in the optimistic category and others that are predominant in the pessimistic category. And then we also show the polarity words. And here, the presence of polarity words in both pessimistic and optimistic tweets. And here, as we can see, a lot of optimistic or positive words appear in optimistic tweets, whereas there isn't a much difference between positive and negative words in the pessimistic tweets. In summary, we found that this topic of analyzing optimism and pessimism in Twitter is less explored. We investigated deep learning models and found that they are able to detect optimism and pessimism better than traditional classifiers. And we show that a sentiment analyzer is not sufficient for accurately predicting optimism and pessimism. As future directions, understanding how one's age is correlated with optimism and pessimism would be an interesting direction, an interesting analysis. So how does it changes over time as we age? It would also be interesting to see if a particular user, if So if we characterize a user by a mixture of topics, if a particular user is pessimistic on all topics, or more pessimistic on some of them, whereas optimistic on others. And then last, it would be interesting to study how pessimism and optimism are affected by sarcasm. And I will end the presentation on a positive note that life's about taking risks, and from the same movie, don't be afraid to put yourself out there. Thank you so much, and I will be happy to take questions now.
Thanks for our speaker. So if you have questions, just raise your hand, and our volunteer will hand you the mic.
Thank you for... Is this on?
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you for your talk, and congratulations on the research. I have one question. You mentioned that sentiment analyzers aren't really suited for the optimistic-pessimistic task. Have you investigated why that is? And have you also investigated other sentiment analyzers, or only the Stanford one?
So now if we look at one example here, so it says, if you missed Mark Drake's awesome class this morning, you have all day to come in and sweat cardio and get sexy. So some of the words are picked as negative, and overall, despite that, this is very optimistic. Yeah, some of the words are picked, and overall, the tweet is labeled as negative by a sentiment analyzer. On the other side, we have sometimes what I really want is right in front of me, but for some reason, I ignore it for something dumb before I go get it. And so the sentiment analyzer gets very confused here again, and some part of it is classified as positive, part of it as negative. So, yeah, it's based on the words and...
So your main conclusion would be that it overfits on certain words.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is the conclusion, yes.
Okay, thank you.
All right, let's thank the speaker again. Due to the time constraints, so we have to move to the next talk.
Thank you.